All right, so this meeting is being recorded and transcribed, just so everybody knows, and it will be posted onto our webpage probably next week at the earliest. Just so everybody is aware, I'm Brian Robertson, Manager of Supply Resource Planning with Cascade, and this is our Technical Advisory Group number 2 meeting. And go ahead and jump to the agenda. And just so everybody's aware, I also have Devin and Megan in the room with me, and we're going to be, all of us are presenting today. And so we're going to have to do some coordination with audio and things like that. So please be patient with us while we move things around during the presentation. So for introductions, what we're going to do, we have a lot of material today. So what we're going to do is we'll just have presenters introduce themselves when they come up to present. And then if you come off mute and have a question, please introduce yourself when you ask that question. That way we know who the question is coming from. And when you introduce yourself, please let us know your title and which company you're representing if you are representing a company. We'll have safety moment, and then we'll jump into environmental policy and compliance. We'll discuss conservation potential assessment, alternative resources, price forecast, and then we'll open it up for feedback for Cascade, and then we'll talk about the remaining IRP timeline and next steps. And I'll just give a quick heads up for this presentation. We are working with a third-party consultant for low carbon alternative fuels. We were hoping to have a little bit more information for this presentation on those low carbon alternative fuels. We're still working through some of those projections, some of the cost projections. And so what I'm thinking, and I don't want to put a date out yet, I'm thinking we may include an extra tag meeting. Maybe I'm thinking in the January timeframe, just so everybody's aware of that while we go through these. And the purpose of that meeting will be to talk about some preliminary numbers. I don't want to go to the final tag meeting with final results before people have been able to see those values for first time. So just a quick safety moment. I'll do winter safety. We're moving into the colder period of the year, so I want to make sure everybody is prepared for the winter. Wear whatever you can to protect yourself from cold and preventing frostbite and hypothermia. Make sure you keep your head warm with a hat. Cover your mouth with face mask or scarf to protect your lungs. Outer coat should be tightly woven and water repellent. Well, wear several loose fitting, lightweight warm clothes. Make sure you wear mittens. It'll keep your hands from getting frostbite. Those are your fingers and toes are the first thing that'll get frostbite. And then wool socks and waterproof boots. And then make sure you wear appropriate clothing for the temperature. Make sure you wear the correct number of layers. The colder it is, the more layers. You don't want to wear too many layers when it's just chilly. What will end up happening is you'll get sweaty, you'll remove layers, and then that sweat will freeze on your body and make you even colder. Okay, with that said, I'm going to pass it over to, I believe, Abby to kick us off on the environmental policy and compliance.
Good morning. Yes, I will be presenting some of the slides here at first, and then I will pass it over to Megan Kelser, one of the environmental specialists on my team, who is with Brian and Devin in the room in Kennewick. And then there will also be Alan Spector and his team, and passing it off a couple times to Devin and Brian. So we'll try to make this as smooth as possible. Appreciate that. And so, yeah, I will start talking about our commitments to reducing emissions. Cascade is an energy provider serving Washington and Oregon, has an important role in achieving state greenhouse gas emissions policy reduction goals. The material presented in this policy and compliance portion of Cascade's TAG 2 meeting represents topics that environmental as well as other departments monitor from state, regional, and local environmental, regulatory, or legislative aspects that could have an impact on Cascade's IRP planning process. Our company has set a methane emissions reduction target to reduce our company's distribution system methane emissions 30% by 2035 compared with our 2022 levels. And our company environmental policy is to operate efficiently to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And our goals in that section are to minimize waste and maximize resources, to be a good steward of the environment while providing high quality and reasonably priced products and services, and to comply with or surpass, go beyond all applicable environmental laws, regulations, and permit requirements. Next slide. So our Cascade.
Byron, do you have a question?
Oh, sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, sorry. So Byron Harmon here, Washington UTC. When you say that the goal is to reduce methane emissions by 30%, does that just mean like distribution system emissions, or are we talking like including customers? Like what's the scope of that goal?
Distribution system operational emissions.
Okay, so all of the above. Do you guys intend to include
Actually,
that as a
Byron,
parameter
Byron, I just want to make sure it's not customer combustion emissions. So it's not emissions. These are scope 1 emissions that we're.
Oh, okay.
targeting.
Okay. Gotcha.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification.
Cascade's emissions from the distribution system and operations include methane leaks or emissions from pipeline infrastructure and combustion emissions from compressors. So Byron, your question here relates to the emissions I talk about on this slide, mainly those methane leaks or methane emissions from the system. So under House Bill 2518 that was passed in about 2020 and then incorporated into RCW 81.88.160, our distribution companies must report known leaks, including non-hazardous leaks, annually to the Commission. And for reporting year 2023, we reported 1,721 metric tons of CO2e. Cascade reports the quantified volumes of leak gas found during leak surveys compiled by our operations employees. And just note that these emissions have been reduced over the past few years as we initiated that program. And I think we started at where we were at about more than 6,000 metric tons of emissions. So now we're down to about 1,721, which is good. And under Ecology's and EPA's greenhouse gas reporting rule requirements, we reported a little more than 27,000 metric tons of CO2e equivalent emissions from Cascade's distribution system in 2023. So this includes methane leaks from mains and services and meter regulator stations, and we have to use EPA's required nationwide emission factors. This also includes our Mount Vernon compressor station combustion emissions. So that 1,721 tons of emissions above, that's actually separate, and EPA doesn't require that kind of emissions reporting in the EPA program. So there might be a little bit of an overlap between those numbers, but not all of those 1,721 emissions are in that 27,000. Okay. And in May 2024, EPA finalized their updates to Subpart W reporting, which is the reporting program that Ecology also requires us to use for reporting Washington emissions. The amendments in that rule apply to our reporting year 2025 emissions coming up, and that we would report in 2026. The amendments include updated emission factors for mains and services, additional emission sources to be reported for distribution systems. And these additional sources include methane emissions from operation of pneumatic devices and blowdowns and other large release events that EPA just doesn't include right now in their reporting program. But again, 2025, we're going to start reporting those, which includes some of those emissions in that 1,721 number. It's kind of hard to parse out because there's so many different protocols that are used over our industry. But other large release events that I mentioned in this is a new category that EPA is requiring reported, and it's designed to capture these abnormal emissions events that occur on our system that might be an instantaneous methane emission rate equivalent of 1,000 kilogram per hour or more. And those are rarer on our system, and they could be represented in kind of a large excavation damages emission event. And I see there is a question for me.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the leak emissions. Are those just sort of incidental emissions that happen just as part of the system, or are they kind of like events that you fix and were not intended?
Yeah, they could include unintended leaks. You could have a fitting that might not be as tight that could be producing a leak, and those are very, very small leaks. And then excavation damages would be another, it would be an example of something that would be fairly large. I don't have blowdowns could potentially be larger, depending on what we need to do with repairs on our system and bringing a line back on track or installing a new line. But there are blowdowns that would be methane leaks. Trying to think there, and again, I mean, these leaks could be throughout where we have fittings mostly on our system, or again, where you would have an excavation damage that would occur. I think that captures the majority of where we would see some of these leaks. Again, they could be on our system. I'll talk a little bit more about the methodology we've implemented to try to look at that more in a little bit. Just touching on that, but so EPA will be requiring us to report more emissions in the subpart W reporting again, which will be reported to Washington as well in our 2025 emissions. One other thing Cascade has done for really understanding our emissions was join One Future to be in a coalition discussing all of these methodologies for monitoring and making emissions reductions in a collaborative way. So we joined that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that more on the next slide. And then EPA did release its 2023 reported nationwide emissions summaries just recently on October 15th. And just a couple stats from that. Per that reporting program data, the total emissions in the US are down by about 4% from last year in that reporting program. And then when you look at the petroleum natural gas system industry sector, it accounts for about 12.5% of those total US emissions. And the distribution sector represents about 3.4% of those petroleum industry emissions. And overall, when you look at natural gas distribution system emissions, they're 0.4% of the total US reported emissions. And all of those emissions in those sectors have gone down this past year. And then when you look at Washington, those numbers are very similar when you look at the statewide emissions from all the different sectors. And with that, I'll go to the next slide and I'll talk about some of our emissions reductions plans. So we continue with our existing programs to implement emissions reductions and then continue to explore and implement new methodologies. So significant area of focus that we've talked about in previous tags for our gas distribution systems, including Cascade is to replace older pipeline with pipelines made of newer materials, such as polyethylene and steel. Cascade is better positioned than most of the other utilities in the US, as we have no unprotected steel pipeline or leak-prone cast iron pipe. Since 2019, approximately 54 miles of vintage steel and plastic have been replaced through our System Safety and Integrity Program, which we call SSIP. And our SSIP team replaces approximately, when you look at across our total company 8-state footprint, it's over 60 miles of main and over 3,500 service lines annually that we have going on. And a significant, let's see, more, I didn't know if we had a question or if there's a question in the chat. Okay. I'm just going to look at Byron's question here. How do the emissions reduction policies compare in terms of cost effectiveness relative to EE or non-conventional fuels? And that's something that I think we're going to try to cover later in the presentation. So let's think about that as we talk about, in particular, maybe one of the slides Brian shares. Okay, but more on the enhanced reporting side, but could lead to further emissions reductions in future. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, released their climate disclosure regulations, and Cascade, with its sister utility companies, began publicly reporting more comprehensive company-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which includes all Scope 1 and 2 emissions. The inventory shows us more complete picture of our company and operational emissions. At this time, we don't have a Washington-specific emissions total available. We have a lot of this information available on our corporate website if there's more questions on this. We anticipate having more state-specific information available that we can parse out as we hopefully implement a software solution in 2025 that will help us manage all of that data in our inventory and help query that data more easily. And then again, I mentioned we joined One Future in 2024. That's a group of approximately 55 natural gas companies from across the entire natural gas value chain. And they're dedicated to reducing emissions intensity to less than 1% by 2025. And the coalition has a collective goal of achieving these reductions through the sharing of information on new emissions measurement and reduction technologies, as I talked about. And Cascade just began participating in One Future this year, and we provided emissions for their 2023 emissions survey. We're evaluating those results in the near future, and we'll use that to learn about where we sit compared to others and looking at that goal and what we need to do to commit to that goal and achieve that 1% if we're above that. And once we started looking at One Future and their protocols, they're also, you get involved in these new coalitions and you realize, oh, okay, there's these other emissions that we didn't even think about that we are inventorying now in our system, and really looking at what is a company-specific emission factor in those areas so that we're not over or under reporting those emissions. We look forward to more engagement with that group and exploring ways in which we can improve our emissions reduction strategies. Cascade's field operations initiated a program for conducting more leak surveys in the past to identify leaks timely and then prioritize those leaks and repairs or leak repairs. We anticipate the process to be further advanced through a deployment of an advanced mobile leak detection technology, PICARO, which I'll talk about just in a little bit. So even the small non-hazardous leaks we identify in our field surveys are prioritized for repair within 12 to 15 months. And for instance, our annual leaks reported, I talked about this a little bit in the last slide, we have seen those go down and pass from about the first time we reported it was about 6,000 metric tons to now it's about 1,720 metric tons per year. And so with PICARO, we began working with PICARO and implementing that technology this past October, and maybe even we started that late September, but in October here, we have been using that system to quantify leaks on our system and have targeted for use of that technology in our Eastern Washington area first. This is our first phase of implementing and checking out and utilizing this technology. We anticipate that we will use it annually thereafter, and we'll learn a lot from this first phase. So what it is it's a vehicle. We mount or equipment on a vehicle, and the equipment is advanced optical sensing equipment to identify methane plumes at very low concentrations as the vehicle drives down streets. And so a lot of, normally we drive this equipment, and we're working with a consultant actually to do the driving of these vehicles at this time, but it's driven at night, so you can have more visibility, I guess, with the equipment to identify methane leaks. The data is collected and includes GIS information that allows our field operations folks to be deployed under our existing processes then to investigate, grade, and repair the leaks or replace pipe as appropriate. And for this first phase, again, we're looking at, you can set your thresholds for what we would call a super emitter leak would be, and that's currently at a 10 standard cubic feet per hour threshold. And we anticipate that we will adjust that threshold in future as we see what those results show. Just preliminary information we're seeing is that we're not really seeing any emissions at that threshold, which is really great. And but we are learning about where we're seeing any kinds of emissions on our system utilizing that equipment. So we're going to wrap up this first phase here at the end of the year, and we look forward to sharing more detail on the technology and what we're seeing with that software. And one of the other things that we want to do with this equipment and the software and analysis of the data that comes with it that Percaro provides is how can we develop an emissions factor that is specific for our company versus using the EPA required nationwide factors, which we don't think represent what we're seeing on our system. So I'll go to the next slide and just talk about some energy efficiency emissions reductions. So we have, through our energy efficiency and conservation program, those folks are going to be talking later on the presentation, but we take the emissions, the savings that we see in those programs and translate that into equivalent emission savings over the year. So excuse me here, I'm just making sure I have my notes right. So, and I have Washington here, or Oregon here as well, just to compare the programs. We've seen a lot of therm reduction since 2019. There was a really large implementation of conservation savings in 2021, and it kind of dropped off a little bit in 2022, and we're back up to about that same level as 21 and 23. So we're looking forward to more maximizing our cost-effective therm savings for all of our types of customers, and then looking at adaptive management for changing codes, standards, and forecasts, utilizing all that information to try to enhance our programs that we deliver. For low-income weatherization offerings, we have targeted outreach, increased participation in low-income EE programs that we see, and then funding 100% cost of the program as we can. And if there are any questions at all on these programs, I'm going to defer to Caleb and Kathy. I would just like to note that in addition to these kinds of programs, there are other emissions reductions that we look at in our company for our customers, and certainly with consideration of compliance with the Climate Commitment Act. So when you look at Climate Commitment Act, we have a lot of options for allowances to meet our compliance needs. However, there are other things we're looking at, such as developing low carbon fuel production projects, renewable natural gas, thermal energy networks that will be talked about later. And then also just something that we're not necessarily covering a lot in this presentation, but how can we look at deploying hybrid heating systems to enable more energy savings on our system, but still remaining a gas supplier to provide that resilient, reliable energy that's needed by Washington and our customers. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Megan, who's going to talk about the Climate Commitment Act.
Camera now.
Hi, good morning. I am on Brian's camera because the Wi-Fi booted me off. But I'm Megan Kelzer and I'm an environmental specialist for Cascade. And I will be going through the Climate Commitment Act in the next couple of slides.
Hold on 1 second. I think Patrick has a question. Let's go back a slide if we can. Yeah, and I don't know, Caleb, would you be able to answer this question?
Yeah, I'm reading it right now, and if I'm understanding Patrick's question correctly, it's referring to the 2021 year, particularly for therms in Washington. Is that correct, Patrick?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it comes down to the cyclicality of energy efficiency, particularly in our commercial sector. And if I recall correctly, 2021, we had a very large commercial project completed. I believe it was a heat recovery for a mushroom farm right around the Washington southern border. And that was a tremendous project with significant therm savings. And those happen typically every 3, 4, or 5 years for us or so. So it's cyclical, but not unusual. Does that answer your question, sir?
It does. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Caleb.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Okay, the Climate Commitment Act, also known as the CCA, was passed by legislature in 2021 as the program started in January of 2023. This is a market-based program that caps and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. The CCA covers 75% of statewide emissions as the policy requires the state's biggest emitters to participate in the Cap and Invest program. The program sets a limit or a cap on overall carbon emissions and requires businesses to obtain allowances equal to their greenhouse gas emissions. The cap will be reduced over time to achieve their goals. So as you can see under anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions rejections, the main goals of this program is to be 45% below 1990 levels by 2030, 70% below 1990 levels by 2040, and lastly, 95% below 1990 levels by 2050 or carbon neutral by 2050. The CCA covers facilities that emit 25,000 metric tons of CO2e per year. Some examples include fuel suppliers, natural gas distribution, landfills, and certain EITE entities, but they will be added during the second and third compliance periods. And then we will just go to the next slide. Ecology is pursuing linking jurisdictions with California and Quebec. They announced this interest in spring of 2023 as we are currently going through public meetings to develop a rulemaking. Ecology anticipates a linkage agreement to occur in 2025 or later. Linking jurisdictions can lead to lower and more consistent allowance prices, market security, and can streamline program operations. A larger shared market can reduce costs and create a more liquid market. Most recently, California, Quebec, and Washington made a joint announcement in late September stating that they are currently considered amendments to their cap and trade regulations to ensure achievement of their 2030 goals. Cascade continues to monitor the Department of Ecology Cap and Invest linkage rulemaking. Cascade's regulated emissions under the CCA include customer and operational emissions. In 2023, customer emissions were about 2 million metric tons of CO2e, as this will depend greatly on weather. Customers' emissions include gas usage from core and non-core customers. Non-core customers that are not covered entities under the CCA and excludes customers that may opt into program individually, fall under the national security designation, or successfully petition to be an EITE entity. Currently, we have not heard from Ecology regarding any opt-in entities. In 2023, the operational emissions were 27,198 metric tons of CO2e. This can vary between 25 to 27,000. This includes methane leakage from large fuel combustion equipment, as we only have one in Washington, which is located in Mount Vernon. Ecology distributes no-cost allowances each October for the following year that can be used for compliance and consignment. This is based off of our baseline, which is the 2015 through 2019 average. The graph demonstrates the projected trajectory of no-cost allowance allocations. So this demonstrates a 7% reduction from baseline each year from 2024 to 2030, a 1.8 reduction from baseline each year from 2031 to 2042, and lastly, a 2.6 reduction from baseline each year from 2043 to 2049. The Climate Commitment Act is based off of 4-year compliance periods. For example, we are in compliance period number 1, which is 2023 to 2026, compliance period 2, 2027 to 2030, and so on. We must demonstrate compliance by November 1st of the year following the end of a 4-year compliance period. In the meantime, we must demonstrate compliance annually by November 1st of 30% of our prior year emissions. In anticipation of linkage, the 4-year compliance periods can turn into 3 years.
I think we have a couple of questions.
Okay.
First is from Will. What is Cascade's plan for using consignment revenue? Someone else may be able to answer better than me, but I think under the CCA, there are rules that require utilities to make the low income whole under the CCA. But someone could jump in and probably explain that a little bit better than I can. But I think that is the plan.
And this is Abby. I don't know if Lori's on. Regulatory affairs would be probably the best to answer that question, but we also not only low-income customers, so we are to make low-income customers whole, but we also provide credits to customers with that consignment revenue. We're providing credits to customers on their bills for that revenue. And we would, depending on conversations we have with the UTC in future, if there are other decarbonization options that we feel are to benefit our customers, we would explore that with the UTC. But at this point, I think from what we're doing, it's crediting our customers back so they can see that revenue coming back on their bills for the costs of compliance.
Exactly. And then Patrick asks, did you say your total emissions estimate can vary by 25 to 27,000?
Yes. So, and let me go to the slide prior to that. I believe it's right there. Yes. Okay. So in 2023, our operational emissions were 27,198, and this can vary between 25 to 27,000.
Yeah. And just to clarify a little bit more, that's the operational emissions. Those are not the customer combustion emissions. Is that helpful, Patrick?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understand that. So it's like that's 100% like plus or minus.
Sorry, can you ask that again?
So if you're saying that the operation emissions for 2023 is approximately 27,000 metric tons, but your estimate can vary 25 to 27,000, that's a plus or minus of 100% approximately.
No, I think what Megan is conveying here is that generally our operation emissions are in that range. We have reported
Oh,
25,000 tons in the past, and this year is 27,198. And I will mention that with these amendments that EPA has required in the reporting rule, we'll probably see this go up because additional sources will then have to be reported, and we're using these nationwide emission factors, which kind of don't allow us to actually show reductions. It's just going to be additional emission sources and using EPA's emission factors for those. So right now it is between about 25,000 to 27,000 on an annual basis. We kind of see our operation emissions, and these emissions again are we have to comply with them with the Climate Commitment Act. So we might see actual increase next year depending on how we end up applying all of the additional sources that EPA is requiring. And then again, looking forward to using a company-specific emission factor through our actual measurements that we're doing with Picaro at some point to show emissions reductions. So we're looking forward to that. So anyway, sorry, I'll let Megan go on there.
Thank you, Abby. Okay, I will move forward. I believe we went through that. Okay. Lastly, in order to comply with our obligation, we have different compliance options. So those include allowances, which can be purchased from a quarterly auction, energy efficiency and conservation, renewable natural gas, and offsets. And we will expand on these compliance options further below. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Megan. I'll jump back in. All right. Okay, so this slide here is showing our projected baseline emissions. And as Megan had mentioned about the EIT customers, so here the actuals, I'm showing the customer emissions for all of Washington State for all of our customers. And that is all those numbers all the way up through 2023. Afterwards, those are the projected emissions that Cascade is responsible for under the CCA. And so you could see that there's a large gap that is the EIT customers that Cascade serves, but they are responsible for their own emissions separately. Are there any questions on that? Okay. So I'll move on. So before I go through the slide, I just want to let everybody know that this is an example. This is not a strategy. This is not our IRP compliance plan. But I do want to talk about allowances and the limitation of allowances. So I know that, Byron, you've brought up a few times about the reliance on allowances. So we've done some digging on allowances, and so there are purchase limits to these allowances, which is applied equally to all customers, which is, I believe, 10% of the allowance pool for the auction. And so if you take this line here, the purchase limit line, and multiply it by 10, that would be what the pool is. Now, each utility or entity that is in the auction is limited up to that 10% of purchase. So if Cascade were to find allowances to be cost effective, we would be able to purchase up to that line. Now, let's say that in 2035, allowances are more expensive than RNG or hydrogen um, or electrification. We would end up choosing that option over allowances. So I just want to make that clear that Cascade can purchase up to that amount. It's not guaranteed that we will purchase up to that amount. And then after that, we will have a compliance need. So you could see in 2038, our emissions, our customer emissions, will exceed the amount we can purchase in the auctions. Now, there's obviously other things that we could do with allowances. So there's obviously the secondary market, which would not be limited to the 10%. So that we could see allowances exceeding that purchase limit. But for modeling purposes in the Plexos model, we will have a purchase limit up to this line. And then the rest will have to be met with, I don't know if we're going to have secondary market in Plexos, but there will be the options of, so that compliance need could be met by RNG, RTCs, hydrogen, synthetic methane, carbon capture, electrification. Are there any questions on that? Oh, actually, I see 2 hands up. I'll let Eric go.
Thank you. I was listening very carefully for that clarifying conclusion you said about purchasing up to the limit. I just want to understand if the limit here, that blue line, is that an economic line? Therefore, it's uneconomic because of comparison for marginal abatement in the dark blue shaded area, or is this something I wasn't aware of before, that that there is a limit on the actual purchase, like in Oregon's limit on CCIs?
Yeah, so this is not an economical limit. This is a limit of what an entity can purchase in the allowances in the auctions. So, for example, if I'm looking at 2038, if you multiply that by 10, there's 20 million allowances, 20 million metric tons of allowances. Cascade is allowed to purchase up to 10%, which means we could purchase 2 million for that year. Whether it's economical, if it's not economical, Cascade would probably purchase less. But that is, yeah, there's nothing about that limit being economical. It is just a set limit in the auction.
Thank you.
Yeah, Will, you want to go now? Well, if you're okay,
Yeah,
I see you
hi.
came off. No
Hi.
problem.
So I think this is a really helpful chart for this exercise. I think it would be helpful to add to the 25% limit if linkage occurs, and having that be part of the IRP plan. I think that would be helpful for the analysis. And Brian, I appreciated you talking about comparing the cost of this limit versus other options. I don't think I would use, I think secondary market might be helpful to add in Plexus. If you can't do that, it might be useful to do price ceiling units as a alternative way, and that might be easy. You can make assumptions about what price ceiling units are when putting it
Yep.
into Plexus, and that might be a simpler modeling exercise for your team to do. But I would just encourage, I think, like looking at that versus electrification, lower carbon fuels and everything else is helpful, but I think adding price ceiling units as a final compliance method would also be helpful to this modeling approach.
Yeah, great question, Will. Thanks. So we do have price ceiling units in Plexos. And I'll also add that we do have bankability to allowances. So we can purchase allowances above this orange line and bank them. And so you may end up seeing some of that as well. Now, there are some limitations on how much you can store per se, and or bank and to take into the future. And so we have that modeled in Plexos as well. Yeah, Byron?
Yeah. So first off, I guess I want to kind of repeat back Will's point about saying thank you for putting up this graph. I think it's a really useful way to like conceptualize the question. I remember in the last IRP, there was this kind of like speculation that Plexos was engaged in terms of like acquiring a bunch of allowances really early on and then dumping them at the end of the model as a way of like minimizing the total like time period costs. I think that we also have to assume that aspects of the CCA will probably continue on indefinitely after 2050. Obviously legislation might happen in the meantime, but it seems like what happened last time with Plexos just dumping all of the allowances in 2050, I don't think that was a real solution to the problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Byron, if I
so-
can
Yeah,
jump in real quick. The last IRP, we did not have this purchase limit included. And so I don't think you'll see that same issue.
Okay.
Just
Great.
wanted to jump in real quick with that. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is that like we're kind of in a little bit of a pickle here. Not to cast shade on ecology, but the rules around the CCA are meant to comply with the state emission goals. And so in terms of like modeling, the state emission goals should hold a certain degree of at least theoretical priority. And whereas modeling to the rules that ecology has created seems to be putting the horse before the cart, so to speak. Like on the one hand, and it puts you guys in this kind of bind where on the one hand, you guys need to model that you're complying with ecology's rules under the CCA, but on the other hand, I think that there has to be this certain acknowledgement when in the last round of IRPs, every single gas company came to us saying that the allowance prices as anticipated under the CCA would not reduce emissions substantially. So we had, looking at Puget Sound Energy, looking at Cascade, looking at Northwest Natural and Avista, that the total allowances to be purchased by those utilities far outstripped the state emission goals. So we were looking at in excess of like 200% of state emission goals just with those 4 utilities, not to mention all the other industries who might have similar analysis. And so I think that somewhere within the IRP, there needs to be a recognition that just focusing on ecology's rules here are kind of putting the horse before the cart, so to speak, and that there needs to be some kind of recognition around that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think I can't speak for all the other utilities and entities under the CCA, but I think for Cascade, this purchase limit should capture that. I don't think you're going to see Cascade having a ton of allowances in 2050. We haven't finalized any modeling, but I believe by 2050, what you'll see is Cascade meeting emissions through RTCs, hydrogen, synthetic methane, carbon capture, whatever it is, the low carbon alternative fuels, or electrification.
Okay, I appreciate that. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Are there any other questions before I move on? Okay, I will pass it over to, am I passing it to Alan?
Sure. And I can also, Elizabeth Torsky, our building code specialist, can also speak to the code as well. If you'd like to address this slide, Elizabeth.
Sure. Thank you, Ellen. Simply for the state of Washington, Washington's I-2066 could have a large impact. We're still kind of waiting to see what that's going to happen, and we can pivot one way or another. that could affect a lot of changes in Washington State's energy code. And again, we won't know the extent of all those until that initiative passes, and then the Washington State Building Code responds to that. As far as Oregon goes, we are still involved in Oregon Department of Energy's Building Code Working Group. They're developing models to meet their legislative agendas, and that's developing. We're participating, and we're going to continue monitoring that to see how that plays out and what we will have to do to accommodate those changes.
Great. Moving to the next slide. Perfect. So like Elizabeth mentioned, there's, as always, Cascade monitors local and regional initiatives that might have impacts on our resource planning. So like she mentioned, there's 2 initiatives right now that we're keeping an eye on. The first, of course, is Initiative 2117 that would eliminate the cap and trade system. That would obviously have some significant impacts if that were to pass, I think, on all regulated entity planning in the state. And then the other initiative that we're monitoring is Initiative 2066 that would prohibit state and local governments from restricting or discouraging the use of natural gas in buildings. And that would have impacts on, as Elizabeth alluded to, the building code that has significant limitations to the use of gas. So we're keeping an eye on both of those. If either of those pass, obviously there's going to be implications for our resource planning, among other things. So those are on our radar. Next slide. In terms of local and regional initiatives on the Oregon side, the City of Bend, their Environmental and Climate Committee, is continuing to convene and have a series of meetings and discussions with members across the community on decarbonization, on different forms of electrification pathways, and then how Cascade, as a local distribution company, can continue to serve the needs of the Bend community and help the Bend community in compliance with their decarbonization targets. So we've continued to have productive discussions with a range of stakeholders in the community, and we're looking at different tools and options that we can put on the table in support of helping the city meet its decarbonization objectives in a way that continues to support energy reliability, affordability, and overall resource adequacy on the system. Next slide. So one of the things that we're looking at more broadly right now, this is kind of moving back to Washington State, is I think, as everybody knows, a TENS law was passed last legislative session that allows local distribution companies to pursue networked thermal energy opportunities, obviously pending approval of our regulators. We'll have to declare our intention to invest in or to pursue networked thermal energy opportunities, and declare that intention. And then if we get approval from our regulators as LDCs, then that opens the door to getting potential funds from the Department of Commerce to bridge the incremental cost between traditional investments that a local distribution company would make in fuel, in infrastructure, and the cost of network thermal energy. So the TENS law would allow us to own, control, or operate and manage any thermal energy network in Washington. Right now, we are looking at what opportunities are available to us to pursue networked thermal energy. We're going to be bringing on a manager of network thermal energy, bringing in an in-house expert to help to pursue this. This is something that at the leadership level of the company, we've gotten support to pursue. And so our business development team is working alongside our external affairs team to begin to basically pursue in earnest any available opportunities. And by pursue, I mean see what is available, what is viable projects, and folks within our service area that are have knowledge or projects that may be viable for the company to look at. And so right now we are just looking at what the possibilities are going to be for us as a regulated utility to pursue. And it's a very interesting and exciting time in terms of the technology. So we're going to see what's there, what pilots we can integrate, and hopefully we'll have some projects to bring to the table. Next slide. And I saw the last bullet there is the gas companies receiving TENS funds are encouraged to coordinate. And Cascade and the other LDCs are beginning to have some conversations to be able to compare notes and make sure that we've got some awareness of where we each are in our pursuit of TENS opportunities, so that we are able to coordinate as appropriate. And we're also having conversations just more generally, with our regulatory staff and Commerce, and with the bills author, to make sure that we're, as LDCs, on the same page and understanding the intent of the law, so that we can continue to effectively navigate in this new space. So in terms of exploration next steps, like I said, we've received internal approvals to actively pursue potential TENS opportunities. We'll be posting for a TENS manager soon. Preliminary meetings are taking place, like I said, with potential vendors and project leads and other folks that are involved in TENS, so we better understand the lay of the land and the intentions of the law and how we can most effectively navigate the space. We'll continue to seek clarification from our regulators on the finer points of the TENS law to make sure that we can meet requirements. And we have been approached in Oregon by various stakeholders I think as an industry. So Cascade and others have been approached to consider future TENS laws. Quinn, I see your hand is up.
Sorry, 1 second. I'm dealing with my cat. So I'm curious what the timeline might look like then for Cascade to send things to the UTC. Are you all waiting on hiring the manager, or just doing a little bit more exploration? And then I guess if you could tell me what kind of efforts are you looking at? I know that in Massachusetts, they, I think, just rolled out one of the first thermal energy networks. And I want to say that's Eversource that did that.
Yeah, we've been following what's been in development on the Northeast as well. So I think you're right about Eversource. In terms of what we're looking at right now, and I'll also defer to our business development team if they want to weigh in, we don't have anything concrete yet. We are having some conversations. It looks like there could be an opportunity up in Bellingham with a abandoned coal mine that is underneath a large portion of the city. Whether or not we're going to pursue that is going to depend on a range of factors, but it is something that we're having some preliminary conversations to see what that might look like and what a pilot would look like in the context of Cascade partnering on that effort. So I don't think we're quite ready to bring something forward yet, but we are in a place where we're putting up the bat signal, so to speak, to folks in the TENS industry to let them know we're interested in any projects that they want to bring our way, so we can take a look and kick the tires. When we have that manager on board, I think that's certainly going to help. Right now, it's the external affairs team partnered with the business development team in taking meetings, having conversations. And I think once we have a little bit more information in detail, whether it's the Bellingham project or there's other projects that emerge, once we're feeling confident in how we could most effectively partner on a pilot, not committing to any particular one yet. Once we have that, then we would take that to our regulators. And I'm sure that we'll also continue to have questions on timing and operation and the intent of the law, and continue to take those forward to make sure that we're doing everything in the right way right from the beginning to increase the likelihood of success of whatever we put forward. All right, next slide, please.
So I think that's it, right, for you, Alan?
Yes.
Okay, let's take a quick 5-minute break. We'll come back at 10:09 and then we'll continue on. Thanks, everyone. All right, it's 10:09. So we'll get going again. And I think, Abby, are you presenting this slide?
Yes, sorry about that. It took
No
me a little
problem.
bit to get off mute. Yeah, I will just briefly, because I think we've covered a lot of these things, but it's just a nice slide to have summarized if you needed to go back to what we feel are some of the major national focus regulations or potentially legislation that could impact our IRP planning. So I'll skip the first one. We covered that quite a bit. The second one is just that EPA is requesting comment on methane monitoring methodologies that could help with company-specific emission factors. And we're going to be participating in comments on that with our trade organizations. So looking forward to that. And then the next one is more of an indirect impact to us. It is the EPA releasing the climate or the Clean Air Act 111D, 111B, referred to regulations that would be that do create electric generation greenhouse gas emission standards for the electric utility industry. That was released on April 25th, and it would require new high load, high operation natural gas combustion turbines to install pollution controls equivalent to carbon capture. And then also any existing coal units that do not install controls would retire before 2032. If they opt to co-fire with natural gas, they'd retire before 2039. Or if they would install full carbon capture sequestration, then to operate past 2039. So they have to really implement all of those very comprehensive pollution controls to continue operating. And then some states and industry have challenged the rule. No stay was issued by either the DC Circuit or the Supreme Court. Oral argument is scheduled in the DC Circuit on December 6th, so coming up pretty soon here. And then just to also note that those rules did not adopt emission standards for existing combustion turbines. So EPA is currently in the process of exploring greenhouse gas standards for those types of units. And I think we had kind of heard that their intent was to maybe even try to release something as a proposal by the end of this year, possibly early next. So we'll be watching that. And then one thing to note on the SEC disclosures rule, which was released in March, the SEC actually voluntarily stayed that rule pending the lawsuit challenges from certain industry and states. So just noting that, but we still have implemented our own corporate level greenhouse gas emissions inventory that is more robust in preparation for what will come out of that lawsuit process. And then anything on the hydrogen front here, I'm just going to pass it off to Megan, as she'll talk about that in a number of other slides coming up here. So I will pass it off to the next person who's presenting. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, and I think we'll be jumping into the conservation potential assessment. So I'll kick it over to Caleb and Jody for that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jody Albert. I'm the Conservation Economic Analyst for the Washington Energy Efficiency Team. And today I'm going to be going over our IRP 2025 update for the Conservation Potential Assessment. So we reran the 2023 CPA load map model with updated inputs from the IRP team. These scenarios only update the specific inputs from the IRP, so the market size changes, weather, and avoided costs. It does not reflect any changes to federal codes and standards that might have occurred since the 2023 study. So once again, this is not a new CPA model like what we will be producing for 2025, but rather we're providing updated scenarios from our prior CPA run. So we ran 3 separate scenarios. All 3 of these use new avoided costs, heating degree days, inflation rate, and distribution system loss. The reference 2025 IRP scenario utilizes the 2025 IRP base demand forecast. The low growth uses the 2025 IRP low demand forecast, and the high growth scenario uses the 2025 IRP high demand forecast. So therefore, the difference between the 2023 CPA case and the new scenarios are all the updated inputs that are listed, and the difference between the updated scenarios are the selected demand forecast. And we can go to the next slide. All right. So this chart is showing the sum of savings by 2045 in 1,000 therms. So by 2025, all of these scenarios that we ran show higher savings than the 2023 original CPA. This is primarily due to the increased savings potential for the commercial sector. By 2030, all scenarios have a higher savings potential than the original CPA. This is due to the increases in the low-income residential and commercial sectors. Byron, yes, I see you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Going back to the last slide, you said that all the variables that had changed were the ones that were shown there. So like looking at the changes in the potential like demand. But Brian had shown a slide earlier showing like that big blue triangle of like emissions that would have to be covered but weren't necessarily able to be covered by purchasing new allowances. And we've heard that a lot of these alternative fuels, such as hydrogen, synthetic methane, RNG, are multiple times more expensive than conventional fossil fuels. Are those additional costs being factored into like the avoided costs to drive conservation?
Brian, would you be able to jump in?
Yeah, so in the avoided cost model, we have that the carbon compliance adder, which includes the CCA price, and then we also add the social cost of carbon as well.
Right, but the marginal cost of fuel, so like that cost of like the next fuel unit gets really expensive when you start looking at like synthetic methane and RNG and hydrogen and stuff like that. Like they're orders of magnitude more expensive than like CCA compliance costs.
Hey Byron, it's Devin from Cascade. I think the question becomes what is ultimately abated, and I think that might end up being an input from the initial analysis run, or maybe it might have to be an action item for a future analysis. Because the way I'm thinking about this is, at least with the preliminary or initial IRP runs that we were doing, it was the cost of allowances that was ultimately, whether it's allowances or those price ceiling allowances, that's the cost that's ultimately abated. So that is the input that's in the avoided cost. Now, if a lower cost but still expensive resource were to supersede the cost of allowances, so for instance, if it were to be synthetic hydrogen or synthetic methane or hydrogen instead of allowances, still acknowledging that, at least based on the way things are currently phrased, the SEC in addition is included in there. But if that marginal abatement resource were to be synthetic hydrogen or synthetic methane or hydrogen instead, then that would be the input in that environmental compliance element of the avoided cost. But I think without knowing exactly what that resource mix is at this point, it becomes that challenge of putting the cart before the horse once again, or that iterative loop of at what point do you kind of settle on what the result would ultimately be. So I think it's still, and it might be a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think at this point, the viewpoint until we get new results, the viewpoint is that the allowances, not synthetic methane or hydrogen, would be the abated resource. But I think that's certainly something that we can explore once we get future results, as looking into that longer term horizon. Perhaps synthetic methane or hydrogen is that abated resource, and then that, I agree, should be the input into the avoided cost.
Okay, it sounds like this is just an ongoing iterative conversation.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you, Devin.
You bet.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Brian. So by 2030, all of the scenarios, once again, have a higher savings potential due to the increases in the low income residential and commercial sectors. This is where we begin to see a decrease in the moderate income residential savings and a decrease in the low growth scenario industrial savings potential. This reduced projected savings for the industrial sector in the low growth scenario continues through 2045. By 2035, we see a decrease in savings for the regular income residential sector for all of the scenarios in comparison to the 2023 original CPA. And commercial savings begin to decrease for all but the high growth scenario. By 2040, industrial savings pick back up for all but the low growth scenario while all other patterns remain the same. And by 2045, we see an increase for the low income residential savings for all the models except the 2025 IRP reference case in comparison to the 2023 CPA. The industrial savings are still higher for all scenarios other than the low growth scenario, and commercial savings remain lower than the 2023 CPA. So overall, the 2025 IRP demand forecast is lower than the 2023 reference case, even in the high growth scenario. The exception is in industrial, where the 2025 case is higher than in 2023, which results in slightly higher potential. The 2025 IRP has higher avoided costs than the 2023 CPA. And this is coupled with a higher discount rate, which blunts some of the impact, particularly for some of the longer lived measures. In most cases, this is insufficient to offset the drop in the savings from the potential population declines, the low income residential being an exception in this case. Many measures struggled with cost effectiveness in the 2023 CPA due to the lower consumption per home in those segments. The higher avoided costs are sufficient to cause more measures to pass, similar to those in the moderate and regular income segments. This offsets the population change and leads to higher low income savings in all three scenarios compared to the 2023 CPA. All right, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the values on the previous slide depicted the achievable economic UCT potential for all of the scenarios and for the 2023 CPA. So as shown in these graphs, the 2025 reference in comparison to the 2023 original achievable economic UCT potential is depicted by the blue line on these images. These show a lower projected consumption and a lower projected savings. So by 2045, the sum of energy savings in the 2025 IRP reference case decreases by 5.9% from the 2023 original CPA. In the residential program, it's projected that the regular income savings will decrease by 7.6%. Moderate income decreases by 8.8%, while the low income increases in savings by 18.7% in comparison to the 2023 CPA case. The commercial program shows a decline of 6.2% in savings, and the industrial program savings increases by 6.5%. We can move to the next slide if there's no questions.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain, and like, I guess, pardon my language here, but the graphs on the right are a bit scrungly. Could you explain why they're the way they are? Like, normally I'm used to like kind of like smoother curves and stuff. These are doing very interesting things.
Yeah, Byron, this is Brian. That has to do with the forecast, and we included retail rates in the load forecast model, and the retail rates were kind of jumpy. So it made some weird results with the demand forecasts. For future IRPs, we're going to look into ways to make it so it's not so jumpy, try to smooth those out a little bit.
So was there something about the data, or like what kind of caused that?
Yeah, so if you recall from the last IRP, so like for offsets and allowances, what it would do, it was trying to purchase at an optimal time, which would be, so what it would do is it would load up in a single year.
Mhm.
So this is kind of a Plexos modeling thing that we need to look into. The problem is if you over constrain it and try to smooth things out inside of Plexos, it can increase run times. So what we did is we ended up leaving it how it was. So what it would do is it would try to wait or do it in the earliest point in time by like, for example, offsets as early as possible when it was the cheapest. And so you'd see this big spike in offsets. And it would really make the cost look funky, and then it would go over into the bill impact analysis. So we're gonna have to look into ways to smooth that out a little bit.
Okay, I appreciate that. I do remember all those, like the spikes and
Yeah.
the charts and stuff. So thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Brian. So, similar to the 2025 IRP reference case, we see that with the 2025 high growth scenario. This also has a lower predicted consumption and savings potential. By 2045, the sum of energy savings in the 2025 high growth scenario decreases by 2% in comparison to the 2023 CPA. This is due to the residential program. It's projected that the regular income savings decreases by 3.4%. Moderate income decreases by 4.9%, while the low income increases in savings by 24% in comparison to the 2023 CPA case. We see that the commercial program shows a decline of 1.8% in savings, and the industrial program savings increases by 6.5%. The next slide. Here we show the low growth scenario. And so once again, similar to the reference case, we see that there is lower predicted consumption and savings potential. By 2045, the sum of energy savings decreases by 8.6%. In the residential program, it's projected that the regular income savings decreases by 10.5%, moderate income savings decrease by 11.4%, while the low income savings increases by 15.1%. And the commercial and industrial programs both show a decline of 6.2% in savings. We can go to the next slide. And so this slide is showing an overview of what I just discussed. This is showing change in savings for each scenario by 2045 from the 2023 CPA. The cumulative energy savings that these percentages are based upon is once again for the achievable economic UCT potential case. In all three scenarios, we see that the largest decline in savings is in the moderate and regular income residential sectors. The largest increase in savings is in the low income residential sector, and the low growth scenario is the only case in which there's a decline for industrial savings. And so rerunning the CPA model will also give us updated savings by measure. This table shows us the top 20 measures by 2045 total savings in 1,000 therms. We see that there's an increase in savings for water heaters, fireplaces, wall cavity installation, boilers, and Energy Star thermostats. Strategic energy management shows an increase in savings for the 2025 IRP reference case scenario and the high growth case scenario, but there is a decrease for the 2023 values in the low growth case. All of the other measures show a decrease in savings in all of the scenarios in comparison to the 2023 original CPA values.
All right, I think that is it for this portion of the presentation. Does anyone have questions?
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I noticed that some of the values don't change between the different columns. So for example, like I think wall cavity is 739, 739 across all of them, but some of the values do. Is that just like a change in like cost effectiveness, or like what drives those differences?
Caleb, would you be able to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Byron, I had the same question when I looked at this first, so I agree with your eye there. What we think it comes down to is boiling it down to what could impact the model, like the whole universe of things, and then thinking about what actually makes the most sense. So in terms of what was changed between all these scenarios, particularly the column 1 versus column 2, the original versus the 2025 reference, we changed heating degree days, weather normals, avoided costs, real inflation rate, and customer demand. Those are the main things. And then the changes between columns 2, 3, and 4 was just that customer demand file. So my interpretation here is that those specific items where you'll note a lack of change between columns 2 through 4, that's going to be items that are not directly impacted by customer demand, but likely are impacted by one or more of those other 4 variables that I mentioned between columns 1 and 2. When I look at it, I'm looking at a lot of insulation type items in particular. So my interpretation says that does make sense based on how Loop Map's analyzing those items.
Okay. Thank you, Caleb.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Sorry, thought I came off mute. Thank you, Caleb, and thank you, Jody, for that presentation, and thanks for the questions. So we'll jump into alternative resources, and I just wanted to throw out that reminder again that we're working at a third-party consultant. So there's more to come on this. Once we feel comfortable with sharing more information, we'll set up another tag meeting to do that. But we'll still go through and talk about the alternatives. And I think I'm passing it over to Devin.
Okay, that's fine. I don't need to use your chair. I can drag a chair over. All right, I will be playing the role of Brian Robertson for the next few minutes. So Devin McGreal, Renewable Resources Manager, but my heart will always be with the IRP. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about some of the renewable resources that we look at with the IRP here at Cascade. Specifically going to focus a little bit about RNG to start. I think a lot of people are a lot more familiar with renewable natural gas than maybe in previous IRPs, but still want to give a nice little top level overview. So from the very beginning, what is renewable natural gas? It's pipeline quality natural gas. So that's important because a big element of it is the cleaning up of it and getting it to that pipeline quality. But it's produced through various biomass sources. From various sources through biochemical process such as anaerobic digestion or gasification. So some examples of types of projects, some of these we currently have. So biogas from landfills, one of the projects that I'm most proud of is one right in our backyard at the Horn Rapids landfill. And then there's also a Lamb Weston biodigester right next to that as a food waste project. But biogas from landfills is one of the biggest ones. It allows us to collect that waste from those landfills and then through a digester, create gas that can be cleaned up and turned into renewable natural gas. Also from livestock operations, dairy manure is a big feedstock for California specifically based renewable natural gas. Wastewater treatment plants as well can be used from it. And then other sources I already mentioned, food waste is a big one, but also manufacturers and wholesalers, supermarkets, restaurants, hospitals, and more. There's a lot of really interesting potential with renewable natural gas, and it's a very fastly or quickly evolving market. So one slide that I've kind of added to this presentation, I feel like a lot of people get confused and there's a lot of conversation about what counts as renewable natural gas. And I think more importantly, how do you avoid double counting renewable natural gas? And so in talking about it, I made this very simple figure on the left that renewable natural gas can really be thought of as two components that are completely separatable and combinable. So first you have the Renewable Thermal Certificate, the RTC. This is priced at the value of presumably some form of environmental compliance. It represents 1 decatherm of mitigation of emissions, right? So if you had a physical molecule of just regular gas that we bought at Sumis, Rockies, ACO, and you, for lack of a better term, stapled or attached this RTC to it, it in theory, or from a emissions recording perspective, negates that 1 decatherm of emissions through this renewable thermal certificate. So kind of to that point, it's represented electronically. It's not actually a physical thing, typically traded through MRETs. So that's the platform that us and a lot of people use to record what that RTC is, who has possession of it, who has credit for it. And that, I think, is the important point when it comes to avoiding that double counting conversation, is taking actually the landfill project that I talked about, the Horn Rapids landfill project. We do not have that RTC associated with that project, and we don't claim to have that RTC. So even though we're involved in the receipt of the physical gas for it, for us, it's just the same as any physical gas project. Whoever has that RTC is the one who gets credit for it. So if you were to develop it, so Horn Rapids develops it, they cannot claim that they have renewable natural gas because they are selling off that renewable thermal certificate. Conversely, if I buy it from a project, whether it's that project or a different project somewhere else, I get to claim that I have the environmental attribute related to it. Even if I was not the developer, even if I was just a secondary market purchaser, I get the claim that it was renewable natural gas because I have that renewable thermal certificate. The second component of it is the physical gas. Simply enough, and I know Byron had a question about this beforehand, it's gas. It's the same gas essentially because it's brought up to that pipeline quality. It's the same gas that you would buy at Sumis, Rockies, or ACO. And in fact, it is typically priced similar to that regional basin. So it's geographically based. It'll typically track wherever the actual project is. So some of our projects, typically when we do deals, in fact, we use whatever basin is around that project to figure out what the value of that physical gas is. It's the physical molecules of it, and it's tradable at the location, right? So typically you would not, although you could end up buying a physical gas project in, say, Kansas and move the gas to us here. But that's not typically what we would do. It would typically be injected. We would trade it or allow somebody else to trade that physical gas to a local user who would then flow it, nominate it, just like a normal pipe system, to a more localized result. So that's kind of how it works with the separation of it. Talked a little bit about some of the RNG projects in Washington, the one that we're really happy and excited about, that Horn Rapids Lamb Weston, and in Oregon, I'd say our flagship project is the Deschutes landfill, another landfill project that we're heavily involved in the development and ultimately the harvesting of those renewable thermal certificates. The potential for related to compliance, we do need to make sure that we're tracking that supporting documentation for our reporting. So things like, what is the feedstock, what is the location, what is the carbon intensity? Even though that carbon intensity, and this is something I'll talk a little bit about throughout this presentation, even though it's not technically needed, or the carbon intensity does not reflect what the ultimate credit is for the reporting programs we're in, it's still important to track it. Some potential restrictions. I'll start again with that carbon intensity. Right now, all of our evaluation of renewable natural gas is done based on the concept that I just said, that 1 RTC equals 1 decatherm of renewable natural gas, or of gas. But that's not the case for every entity. Carbon intensity, the concept of how much carbon does a project mitigate, matters in some jurisdictions. And there is talk in both Washington and Oregon of potentially changing that. It's nothing that's really, I think, on the horizon, but it's always conversations that are being had. If that changes, so that if that 1 decatherm was worth maybe 3 or 4, or that 1 RTC was worth 3 or 4 decatherms, or maybe half a decatherm, that completely changes the economics of the projects that we're evaluating. So it's something we need to keep an eye on. And then there's also the book and claim concept. It's that idea that I can go and buy an RTC from that project in Kansas. And because there is a common pipeline, as long as it is injected into a pipeline over there, because the gas could theoretically make its way to Washington or Oregon, we're allowed to claim it through that book and claim process. But there's always conversations. These programs that we comply with are always evolving. So that's something we need to keep an eye on to make sure that they are still going to allow that. Some additional opportunities, the fact that it's an emission reduction resource is, I think, the biggest one, and that's the primary use of it. But another exciting one that I think has a lot of potential is the ability of it being a peak day on system resource. Now, we need to do a lot more research about what actually flows on peak day. That is one of the challenges with RNG as well, is that when it gets a lot colder, which is when our peak days are, sometimes the amount of RNG produced does not match the normal load through the chemical biological processes that I'm not an expert on. But I do know that there are some restrictions to how much you get. And so we don't want to necessarily use it for peak day reliability at this moment until we get a more concrete understanding. But there is that potential there that at least some of that gas in the Deschutes landfill, I think, is the best example of that. Some of that gas will go directly into the Bend distribution system and can be used on every day, but especially for peak day. I think that's a really interesting and good opportunity some of these localized situs projects offer. So what is a renewable thermal certificate? We kind of talked a little bit about it already, but basically it's just a market instrument that incentivizes the use of those renewable energy sources. Some people might be used to RECs, renewable energy credits, and that's for electricity generation for things like wind or solar. RTCs, renewable thermal certificates, are specifically for thermal applications. I already talked about the mechanisms. It's traded through MRETs. The restrictions and opportunities can vary based on the program that it's being used for. But overall, it's a really good way to drive investment in these renewable programs to help promote the transition to a more sustainable energy system. So from Cascade's perspective, I want to talk a little bit about our principles of RNG cost effectiveness evaluation. And before I get into that, I think Byron had a really good question about, do we ultimately look at RNG from a least cost, and Byron, I don't want to butcher, I don't remember off the top of my head the exact phrasing you had, but it was really good. It's the least cost resource versus cost effectiveness, or most reasonable least cost, I think is what you said, versus cost effectiveness. The way we like to look at it is cost effectiveness is the primary test that any RNG project goes through. The rationale of that being, if a project is truly self-sustainingly cost effective, meaning as when we go into the formula on the next slide, if it ends up being a net positive project, as long as there's a theoretical need for the RNG, we would want to do that no matter what, because it's just economically positive for us. If it's not cost effective, then the second test is that lowest reasonable cost analysis, where it's evaluated against other RNG projects, for instance, or electrification, or CCIs even, to see if it then passes a lowest reasonable cost test to be considered a project worth procurement. But if it's cost effective, and even if theoretically, now this is getting into kind of a different subject altogether, but theoretically, if a project was cost effective, even if we didn't necessarily need the RNG, it should at least be considered maybe on a non-regulated side, for instance, which is not something that we're actively doing, but could theoretically be done if kind of the evaluation of the project said that this could be something that would make money ultimately. It could be considered on a non-regulated side, for instance. But so there's a number of factors that we look at when we kind of put together that cost-effective evaluation. There's things like the hedge value of RNG. We're able to lock in a particular price by doing that versus being exposed to the market and having that floating. The value of the environmental attributes, which we talked quite a bit about. And there's also some cost savings related to building versus buying that I think we still have some work to do in terms of fleshing that economics out of it. But I will talk a little bit about it briefly. When you build a project, because you are essentially the investor to some extent in it, you can ultimately, at a marginal cost perspective, get it for a lower cost. If you're projecting a project will produce 100,000 decatherms a year, and you're the one that's involved in the building and development of it, you're going to get it at a lower price than if you were to just go to a broker and say, hey, you have a project that's producing 100,000, I want to get in on that. The challenge, however, is when you do it from the buying perspective, you pay for what you get. So if I have a contract for $10 to buy RTCs from a developer for 100,000 and they only send me 50,000, I'm only paying for that 50,000, not that 100,000. However, if I was an investor in the project, now I will caveat this with saying there are things we can do in the contracts to protect us against this to some extent. But there are some risks that if I was expecting 100,000, but our contract said they only had a 50,000 minimum requirement, and we only received the 50,000, and our economics of the project were based on receiving 100. So if we invested, say, $2 million expecting 100,000, that all of a sudden changes and makes it less economically attractive theoretically. And so that's a consideration that needs to be done when evaluating these projects. Ultimately, we do see it's a critical resource in our projected resource stack, specifically related to the CPP and the CCA, as I think we're going to see in the results of the final analysis that Brian does. But it must ultimately be acquired prudently. Finally, there are still opportunities to buy RNG, even when it's not necessarily seen for CCA necessity. So there's certain regulatory exceptions, such as SB 98, which as a smaller utility, we don't have a specific number requirement, but we do typically try to stick around the same targets as the large utility, which is to not exceed revenue requirement by more than 5% when evaluating RNG projects to be put through SB 98. I'll get into the formula next. I want to kind of try to simplify this. Anybody could just read this off, but the very top level opinion of this is if I figure out the cost of the RNG, which is going to be what am I investing, if anything, in it? What are some avoided costs that we might have? So if I, for instance, don't have to utilize upstream transportation, that's an avoided cost. If I don't have to, if I could theoretically avoid a distribution system enhancement because of this, that would be a downstream, which is the ACU and the ACD. Those are potentially avoided costs that make the RNG more attractive or theoretically less expensive. And then I want to get basically just the price of the avoided cost, any kind of variable cost I would have to pay to move it to my distribution system. So if, for instance, here in Washington, I found a project out in Seattle that I wanted to do, I would have to figure out what would be the cost to move that to one of my distribution systems. There would be a variable cost in that. And then finally, there's that carbon intensity factor that I talked about. Right now, it's not really a relevant element to this. The carbon intensity factor, it's basically just one. It's basically just one in terms of the carbon impact of it. But what this also does capture is that marginal abatement cost to not having to, whether it's buy CCIs in Oregon or buy allowances in Washington, it captures that marginal abatement cost, which is honestly one of the more important elements of the renewable natural gas, why you're procuring it to potentially avoid having to buy a more expensive resource. Then you multiply that by the quantity. The cost for the conventional is very simply, what does the gas cost you and how much do you have to pay to move it? You end up doing that evaluation, and then that final statement of if the cost of the conventional is greater than or equal to the cost of the RNG, project should be considered cost effective and probably should be acquired. If it's not, however, then we still want to look at that lowest reasonable cost analysis. Does it end up meeting a requirement at the lowest reasonable cost compared to other alternatives? Does it fit into an SB 98 analysis? Those are the kind of things we'll look at in that kind of portion of the analysis. This is basically just gives a snapshot of everything we just talked about as a, what does it look like in our model? So these are not real numbers, but it's things like the case RIN selector is how should we value that carbon mitigation value. So this just chooses the D5 RIN market as the value for it. Let's say we had a food waste project and we want to just look at it from a D5 RIN perspective as what we could get back if we wanted to sell this project. That's what that valuation is, and that goes into the economics of it. How long is the project? What's the expected output? What investment do we need to do into this? Do we actually need to pay the full investment, or are we only paying a share of it? Are we getting the full volume, or are we only getting a share of it? And then I think one thing that's also important is that inflation escalator. Some projects will the producers will ask for an escalator to match, say, CPI, for instance, and that also affects the economics of the project. And then we end up, all of this kind of does, and the model calculates a potential market value or that enterprise value. If that's positive, then that's the cost effectiveness, full steam ahead. If it's not, then we kind of try to reduce it to a dollar per decatherm value to be able to do that lowest reasonable cost analysis. I already talked a little bit about this, but once again, purchase versus build, I think, is really an important analysis that, to be completely candid about it, I think we still have some work to do on. We need to, as we start gaining more experience in these projects and getting ideas of what is some of the variance that we can expect on expected versus actual, both on investment costs and ultimate outputs, and allow us to do some better stochastic analysis to be able to make a fully risk conscious decision when we do some of these procurement versus build decisions. But it's things that we are constantly thinking about. We are already, to some extent, accounting for some of the risk associated with that purchase versus build. But I still think there is a lot of opportunity for us to evolve that analysis. And I think we will as we gain more experience and more data to be able to do that stochastic analysis based on it. Finally, some future considerations for us. The risk reduction value from the avoided cost. That kind of, I think, is a way that we could potentially capture the hedge value of RNG. I already talked about stochastic analysis of key inputs, and then modification of that CIF factor. Basically, like I said already, what we currently use is just the whatever the regulatory instrument is for the state. So whether it's an Oregon analysis, we would use the CCI cost, or Washington, we would just use the cost of allowances. But as Brian and his team starts to get us more inputs about what that true marginal abatement cost might be, that should probably be the input for these models to get an idea of what's truly ultimately being avoided, whether it ends up being synthetic methane or hydrogen or some other resource, or maybe it is still in fact that CCI or allowance. Those are the things that we are looking at potentially evolving our model with in the future. So I think I am done here. Byron, I see you have a question.
Yeah, this is kind of a complicated question I have. And you tend to be good at answering these types of questions.
Thank you.
So going back to Brian's graph earlier with the big blue triangle and the need to kind of like fill that decarbonization gap. We've been kind of hearing from a lot of the utilities that the anticipated amounts of RNG aren't actually anticipated to be able to meet the full demand. Is there an added value to, say, like aggressively contracting out RNG before it's needed in order to, like, I guess, like capture as much of the market ahead of time? Like, is there like a way to like quantify that added value of aggressively seeking it out ahead of time in anticipation of that like allowance gap?
This is excellent question, Byron. Honestly, I think this really does get to the crux of a lot of, in my opinion, the most important output purely from my perspective as the renewable resources manager. This gets to the crux of that analysis, right? Is this question of, when trying to do a full long-term analysis, it's kind of that path dependency that I know we've talked about in prior TAG meetings, is does it end up being cost effective to acquire those resources now? Understanding that you're paying for those resources potentially now. You might be able to get a long-term contract, but typically they will want you to start taking delivery and paying for those resources now, with the understanding that it allows you to lock up a resource that could be very scarce and valuable in the future. So I think there's two parts to the answer I'm going to give. The first is the path dependency question. Before getting into that almost risk premium of locking up a key resource, path dependency question, I think, is one that I'm very excited to see what the answer is, because evaluating things like the present value, the opportunity cost of locking up that money is going to be important to determine that. But then getting to the question of that risk premium, I might be a little bit more bullish on this market than others. And I think I'm really excited to see what the result of the study that Brian's going to get about the resource potential from the market. But I think getting an independent third party resource potential analysis will be important to determining the level of scarcity that we might ultimately be facing with it. I'll tell you right now, purely anecdotally, being in the market, I have not had challenges in having conversations about procuring RNG. If anything, I've been surprised with how many opportunities I've had to turn away, whether it's for cost effectiveness or frankly just potentially not necessarily having a need if it's more of a short-term project, for instance, and we might be feeling pretty good in the short term. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. Figuring out where that will translate to 15, 20 years from now is going to be very difficult. And I think, once again, that third-party resource potential, I think, is going to be a good way to figure out, is there that scarcity, and then is there that benefit towards early aggressive procurement? But the one thing I will say, once again, anecdotally, is I'm not seeing that problem in the short term, being it as a player in the market. I'm not seeing that problem in the short term. So I do feel confident, at least in the short term. And then in the long term, I'm excited to see and go off of that third party analysis. But then, yeah, I still think, however, the path dependency question is an excellent one, and one that I'm excited to see the result of in this IRP.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. I think that's it for me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and awkwardly back out now and let Brian take over. And I think you're kicking it to Megan, right?
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, hello. I will be going through hydrogen, as we'll start at the state of hydrogen. So low carbon fuels such as renewable natural gas and hydrogen will be critical in meeting the dual goals of decarbonizing energy pipelines while maintaining the benefits provided by a distribution system. The Biden administration has made a focus in their infrastructure and IRA to set up funding to advance hydrogen technologies and clean hydrogen production to decarbonize the energy system. The IIJA and IRA contain funding and provisions to advance technology. For example, the hydrogen shot, where DOE has a goal, is also known as the 111 goal. This is to reduce the cost of clean hydrogen by 80% to $1 per 1 kilogram in 1 decade. In September of 2022, the DOE issued $7 billion to support 6 to 10 hydrogen hubs as part of a larger $8 billion regional clean hydrogen fund funded through the BIL. These hubs will contain production, processing, delivery, storage, and end use of hydrogen. Cascade is not involved in these projects. However, there are projects that we will monitor in case they provide opportunities in the future. We can move on to the next slide, Brian. Thank you. Hydrogen research. Our sister company, Intermountain Gas Company, has signed to participate in a low carbon joint venture in 2021 by GTI and Electric Power Research Institute, also known as EPRI. The goal of this 5-year initiative is to accelerate the development and demonstration of low carbon energy technologies. The LCRI is targeting advancements in low carbon electric generation technologies and low carbon energy carriers such as hydrogen, synthetic fuels, and biofuels. GTI is focused on clean hydrogen production, storage, delivery, and end use. Lastly, the 45V tax credit is a provision in the IRA that creates a 10-year incentive for clean hydrogen up to $3 per kilogram. The level of this credit is based on carbon intensity, up to a maximum of 4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. This tax credit can be a key tool for increasing the production of low carbon hydrogen. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you. There are different types of hydrogen, which are often categorized by color based on their production method and environmental impact. This slide demonstrates different types of hydrogen. We are currently working with a third-party consultant to provide projections for these. We have received preliminary results, however, nothing is ready to share. Cascade is looking at these 5 types of hydrogen, but will likely only model blue, turquoise, and green. We can go on to the next slide, Brian. Thank you. Hydrogen research. So as you can see on the left side of the screen, Hydrogen Scale in Texas and Beyond is a project supported by DOE and Fuel Cell Technology Office. This is a proto hub with multiple forms of renewable hydrogen generation and end users. This site will include hydrogen generation from steam methane reformers using landfill renewable natural gas and electrolyzers using variable renewable power generation from wind and solar sources. So this intends to show that renewable hydrogen can be a cost-effective fuel for multiple end-use applications. Now on the right side of the screen, assessing hydrogen compatibility in the natural gas infrastructure is being supported by GTI Energy researchers. They are demonstrating hydrogen blending for utilities across the nation and coordinating industry participation and funding to create public accessible tools to characterize the opportunities, costs, and risks of blending hydrogen in the gas infrastructure. They plan to provide information on its effects on safety, leakage, durability, and material integrity. GTI is also assessing the corrosion and hydrogen embrittlement mechanisms associated with the addition of hydrogen and looking at the impact of hydrogen blend on end-use equipment. A select number of natural gas distribution companies have begun pilot projects with hydrogen blend rates target up to 15% in well-controlled systems, serving up to several thousand customers. And it looks like Byron has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Are these tests being conducted on the transmission system as well, where there's a lot higher like pressure on the lines? Or is it all just distribution system?
That is a good question that I'm not too sure. If anyone knows, would they like to jump in? And if not, I will look into that and get back to you.
Yeah, staff highlighted last year in its comments that there was a hydrogen gas pipeline explosion when a oil pipeline was transitioned to transporting hydrogen early in the 2000s, like around like 2002, 2004, I think. And so like for these higher like pressure lines, there seems to be a greater risk of that. So I just want to kind of highlight that as an imperative for research.
Yeah, hey Byron, this is Devin. I think, yeah, I don't want to speak for the upstream pipelines on that. Ultimately, we're going to follow their guidance when it comes to what they may or may not be comfortable with blending in their pipes. That's their call, and we're going to follow their lead on that. I think the reason why Megan kind of highlights the distribution side of it is that's the stuff that we ultimately do control. But I think the upstream stuff is, we're going to be beholden to whatever our upstream transporters want, and we're gonna follow their lead on that.
Thank you, Devin. And if there's no other questions, I am done with the slides, and I think I'll pass it off to Brian.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to go through this slide and then we'll take another 5-minute break and then we'll finish off the presentation. So yeah, there's a couple of other low carbon alternative fuels that we're looking at. Synthetic methane, which is green and pink hydrogen made through electrolysis. It can be combined with waste CO2 to produce synthetic methane using chemical or biological processes. This process, known as methanation, entails incremental cost to the production of green and pink hydrogen. So that'll be included in the low carbon alternative fuels projections. We don't have those results yet, so I have nothing to share on those. But hopefully soon we will be able to. And then we're also looking into carbon capture and storage. which is a process in which a relatively pure stream of carbon dioxide from industrial sources is separated, treated, and transported to a long-term storage location. And here, there's an update to this slide deck that was from when we sent it out last week. We are only looking at carbon capture for large industrial customers. Originally, it said for all customers, but we're looking at it doing the carbon capture on the large industrial customers. And then carbon capture is not currently eligible for Oregon or Washington compliance programs, but these projects could provide a way to offset carbon. So we just wanted to throw that out there as well. So are there any questions on synthetic methane and carbon capture? There will be more information on those soon. But if there's any initial questions, please let me know. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so we'll take a quick 5-minute break again. Come back at 11:09 and we'll finish out this presentation. All right, everyone, it's 11:09. We have about 10 to 12 more slides left, so we're gonna go ahead and get started and get through those slides, and then we'll open it up for feedback at the end. And I think I'm passing it off to Jenny.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. Hi, my name is Jenny DeBoer. I am a resource planning economist on Brian's team, and today I'll be talking a little bit about our price forecast. So first, we'll look at the long-range market outlook. This is from EIA. Typically, they produce an annual long-term energy outlook annually. However, there was no release in 2024. The next edition should be out in the spring of 2025, but for now, we are just using the 2023 version because it is the most recent. Domestic natural gas consumption for electric generation is projected to decrease by 2050, while industrial natural gas consumption is projected to increase. Natural gas production is projected to increase across all cases, due in large part to increases in LNG export demand. Taking these factors into consideration, the EIA projects that the Henry Hub price will remain at or below $4 per MMBTU through the projected period in most cases. You can see that low oil and gas supply scenario runs higher, but the rest, for the most part, run at or below that $4 per MMBTU. We did get a question on how this price forecast compares to our previous IRP forecast. This EIA forecast is similar to the one used in the 2023 IRP. Similarly, we saw prices drop in that short to medium term in that $2 to $4 band, and then rise up closer to that $4 price in the long term. Next, please. Now we'll talk a little bit about our sources. Our long-term price forecast is a blend of current market pricing along with long-term fundamental forecasts. These forecasts come from sources such as Wood Mackenzie, Energy Information Administration, Northwest Power and Conservation Council, S&P Global, the Intercontinental Exchange, and various third-party forecasts. For confidentiality reasons, we can't get into the specific percentages used for each of these forecasts, but we can, in future slides, we get into how we calculate those percentages. While not a guarantee of where the market will ultimately finish, the Henry Hub NYMEX price is the most current information that provides some direction to future market prices. Wood Mackenzie has a good long-term forecast that comes out about every 6 months. This forecast is at a monthly level by basin. So we use this forecast to help us shape other sources that may have a Henry Hub forecast, but not a forecast for the basins we purchase gas from, or if there's a forecast with annual rather than monthly prices, we can use the monthly basis prices of the Wood Mackenzie data to help shape the forecast from other sources. Next, please. We also rely on EIA's forecast. However, as we just talked, it has its limitations since it's not always as current. Further, the EIA forecast is monthly in the short term, but it is annual in the long term. So that's one of those that we use the Wood Mackenzie data to help shape and get that month-to-month data. CNGC assigns a weight to each source to develop the monthly Henry Hub price for our planning horizon. Although it's not impossible to accurately estimate the future, although it is impossible to accurately estimate the future, I'm sorry. For trading purposes, the most recent period has been the best indicator of the direction of the market. However, we can include other factors like historical constraints, which can lead to minor adjustments in the final price forecast. We do have a mechanism that allows us to make some qualitative adjustments to the analysis, but this is something that we want to use very sparingly and even avoid using when possible, because we just want to avoid adding any subjectivity. Next, please. Now getting into how we weight our sources. We produce a weighting system based on the symmetric mean absolute percentage error of our sources going back to 2010. And this calculation is the absolute value of actual minus forecast over actual plus forecast divided by 2. Using the SMAPES, we then calculate the weight of the inverse of these from each source, and then smooth using Holt-Winters smoothing, which I'll talk about in the next slide. you talked about earlier, some forecasts are produced more frequently than others. So we have an age dampening mechanism to account for this in the price forecast. If anything gets too old, too stale, we want to make sure that we are dampening that. Next, please. So here we have an example of the unsmooth and smooth weight calculations by source. You see in the unsmooth graph, the weights bounce up and down from month to month. And what you're seeing is kind of like an overfitting due to the growing sample size of our data. So in reality, does that source really have outsized prediction skills in months T+12, T+14, and T+16 and struggle, and T+13 and T+15? No, that doesn't really make sense, right? It's just kind of by chance how the actuals ended up going with the forecast. If it's a more gradual rising trend, rising or falling, then that's one thing and indicative of sustainably high prediction power. But this month-to-month jumpiness is not something that we see in reality. So we just want to smooth that out. And you can see that in the bottom graph, that smoothed out version. And you see those two sources that were the highest in the first graph are still the highest of the second. So it just kind of smooths everything out. It doesn't really change things all too much. Next, please. Price forecast weight adjustments. So for T+1 to T+12, the first year of data, we use exclusively NYMEX forward pricing. The marketplace is ideal for short-term forecasting because the forward price should have the current events and market conditions like weather and storage baked into the price, whereas long-term forecasting is more concerned about the fundamental market intelligence found in our other sources. So then for months T+13 to T+48, we interpolate from exclusively NYMEX down to the smoothed weights from our SMAPE calculation. And then months T+49 onwards are used. We use those weights from each source in our age dampened if necessary. We did have a question on the slide of how does this method compare to the previous IRP forecast? And the methodology has not changed from the last IRP forecast. Next, please. Here are example weights from our price forecast. We don't want a large month-to-month change between T+12 and T+13. You can see October 25 is our T+12 in this example. And on the left graph, we jump from 100% forward pricing usage to these large chunks of the other sources. So in reality, that's going to cause a large shift in price from month 12 to month 13, which is not what we want to see in our price forecast. So rather than that big jump, we want to take that 100% and slowly bring it down over the course of a couple of years from periods T13 to T48, T+48. And while we're ramping down the weight of the forward price, you can see in the interpolated graph on the right, you're ramping up the other sources to their full weights. And you can see too, when we're adding those weights in, it's not an equal percentage, it's still proportional to the SMAPE calculations we calculated. Next, please. And then here's our current price forecast on the right. We also included the one from 7/24 just a couple months ago because this was used in the avoided cost calculation. We had a question of how does Cascade consider future price volatility and increasing uncertainty farther into the future than the forecast looks? And we plan to include Monte Carlo simulations on natural gas prices in the future. That's all I had. If there were no questions, I could hand it back over to Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Are there any questions on the price forecasts? I also wanted to mention that we will do Monte Carlo simulations on the price forecast, which will, I think in previous presentations, we've shown Monte Carlos, and you'll see that it'll stress test to the very end of the 20-year or the planning horizon. and it'll show a lot more variability in those later years. So Byron, go ahead.
Yeah. How has the methodology changed between this IRP and the last IRP? Perhaps I wasn't paying close enough attention.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
hasn't changed since the last IRP.
Yeah, so the methodology hasn't changed, it's just been updated.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I'm gonna open it up. We'll pause for 15, 20 seconds. I know there's a lot to digest in these 3-hour meetings. If there's any questions, please feel free to jump in. I'll also mention that, and I'll put it in the chat. You can reach us at irp@cngc.com. So this is an email address you can email us at. You can email me if you want, brian.robertson@cngc.com. Either of those will reach me. The IRP is monitored by multiple people, so we might be able to get back to you a little quicker if you go there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Yeah, thanks for jumping in and asking questions, Patrick. We really appreciate it. We find the collaborative effort in these IRPs to be very helpful. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So originally I had set this up, review plans for tag 3. I'm actually just going to jump to the next slide, which has our schedule. So to talk about the next steps, we're going to try and shoot out a first draft of the IRP. So the first draft will likely only have a couple of chapters, but we want to try and get those out as early as possible, get feedback on those. So you'll likely see the demand forecast chapter, the avoided cost chapter, environmental compliance chapter, things that you may not see. We'll have the supply chapter as well, but it may not be fully completed. There may be some information that is not updated. We may have placeholders. We'll try and get as much information in there as we possibly can. You won't see, for example, like the resource integration chapter yet. We're going to be doing a lot of that modeling over the next 2-3 months. So that information will be in the final draft that you'll see in March. But this way we're able to get a few of the chapters out of the way early. That way it allows stakeholders to review it, not all at once. It's a lot of material to read at once. I think the last IRP was over 200 pages and 1,000 pages of appendices. And so we're going to try and break that up a little bit. We'll also, like I had mentioned, kicking around the idea of having an additional tag meeting. That way we can present some of the preliminary results before we get into the final integration results. So I think that's all that we have today. I'm going to pause for another 20 seconds or so. If anybody has any questions, feel free to bring those up right now. If there are no questions, we can adjourn. And if questions come up after this meeting, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to meet and chat about any of those questions you may have. So yeah, Byron, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like I've been asking too many questions, but earlier I had asked a question about the cost effectiveness of distribution system emission reduction policies. And we had said that we were going to address it somehow later in the IRP meeting today. And then it didn't come up again, so I just want to flag that.
Okay, so the question, can you restate what the question was again?
Yeah, so there were all these policies you guys were talking about, Abby was talking about for reducing distribution system emissions. And I was wondering what the cost effectiveness of those policies are compared to other emission reduction strategies like energy efficiency, or decarbonization, or like use of like non-conventional fuels. So like where do those policies kind of like fit into that kind of lowest reasonable cost analysis?
Appreciate the additional information there. Byron, I was thinking that you were looking at customer emissions for some reason when you asked that question. So looking at operational emissions and the cost effectiveness of us going out and using like a Picaro system to more get a better look at our system and getting more accurate measurements. We're going to learn more about that and the cost effectiveness of that. Right now we are, for instance, if we can use a method of actual measurements of our system and get an accurate measurement of what's actually happening, we think that that's going to show lower emissions. We're testing that out with the use of Picaro. And then because we're using emission factors from the EPA that are nationwide and that don't allow us to demonstrate any kind of emissions reductions. It's just a factor of like an emission per mile of pipe based on the type of material. It doesn't allow, it allows you to kind of get like the snapshot of what could be going on, but it doesn't show you what the actual emissions are because everybody's systems are different and there's different methods of how distribution companies manage their systems. So when you look at the implementation and cost of Picaro, in order to develop an emission factor for us to use, it is currently more cost effective than purchasing allowances. So that in itself, I think says a lot. Even at allowances that are lower cost, like what we're paying today versus what we would pay in the future. And then when you compare that to the cost of, once you measure that and then can go after those leaks and fix them and not have them occur anymore, that's a one-time cost to do that. It is more cost effective to do that than buy allowances ongoing. So we haven't put all the numbers together because we need to understand how much do we have to run Picaro on our system to reduce uncertainty with emission factors that we can develop with that technology. And we'll be excited to share more as we learn more. And maybe in early 2025, we'll have a little bit better handle on that. So, and then when you compare that to, we could compare that to energy efficiency, but we would really like to not have to purchase allowances and just reduce those emissions, plus their methane emissions versus just CO2. Methane has a higher global warming potential, right? And it has a more higher impact in a shorter time period. The impacts from those emissions, if you can reduce them, reduce faster over time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's those factors that we're, think that also benefits us from using that kind of a technology to help reduce our emissions. So with that, I'll pause and see if there's any other question you had on that.
I guess so. Are you guys actually doing some kind of like cost-effective analysis on it, or is there just kind of a presumption that it is cost-effective? Like, is that being supported by a kind of like quantitative analysis, or is at this point is there just kind of a assumption that it will be? Not to say that that's inherently problematic, but just to like where's that kind of coming from?
I'll ballpark this a little bit for you. So let's say it costs $1 to $2 million to implement the capital cost for Picaro in that range. And and if we show our emissions are much lower using that, we might not be we might not even meet the threshold potentially of being a facility for operational emissions under the Climate Commitment Act. And we wouldn't have to buy any more allowances in future compliance periods. So that would save us millions of dollars to do that, because let's just do it back of the envelope. $50 times 27,000. That's $1.3 million right there in 1 year. So depending
Gotcha.
on what those emissions are, it could be really, it would save the customers money for sure. And we wouldn't be emitting as much.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Abby. Thank you, Byron, for that question. Are there any other questions before we let everyone go? Okay. I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll let everyone go. You guys should hear from myself, whether it be the first draft that we send out, or if when we plan on adding an additional tag meeting. So we'll keep everybody informed on that. So thanks for attending our meeting, and thanks for all the questions today. It was very helpful to run through all those questions. So appreciate it. And we'll talk to everyone later.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank
Thank you.
you.